Let's all stand as we bless his name together. Baruch hu Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach, Leolam Vaed. Blessed be the Lord who is blessed. Blessed be the Lord who is blessed forever and ever. Amen. From the cornerstone of our faith, Devarim, Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his name, whose glorious kingdom is forever. Amen. And when Messiah was asked the question, Rabbi, what is the most important command? He answered with the words of the Shema and said the following: Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha v'chol levavecha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavacha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shiftecha b'beitecha u'v'letocha v'derek u'v'shapeka u'v'kamecha u'shartom le'od ayadecha v'hayu letodefot beinenecha u'ktavtam al mezuzot beitecha Ovisharecha. And for those who didn't know fluent in Hebrew, here comes the English. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Messiah then said, the second command is like unto the first, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, we are going to sing some songs of praise and of worship, and they all line up with the message as well for today. I just want to mention one other thing too, is when we do have the Hebrew on the screen, if you try, I had this experience. I went to a Spanish church, and they had in Spanish and in English, and I was doing the English, and I said, let me just try the Spanish. And before the end of each song, I was really kicking with it. So if you after a while, it becomes second nature. They'll think you're all Israelis. It'll be great. So we're going to start this week's portion. We're in Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus. And it talks about the atonement. And so we're going to sing the first song, which is Forgiven. Let me make one adjustment here. This is going to be my kippah's off center. Is that better, honey?
Just a little bit.
Is my tallis tilted too?
Well, we'll talk
Am I okay now?
later.
All right, this is just between you and me. Don't let anybody else hear it. All right. Okay. All right, so here we go. We are going to start with this, and here we are. This will be kind of interesting because it should come up on the screen. Pretty dramatic. Here we go. Forgiven. No. Forgiven. Forgiven. A great weight is lifted. Forgiven. Like a stone rolled away. Forgiven. For the sins I've committed. Forgiven. Of all my guilt and the shame. 'Cause I'm forgiven in your name. I'm forgiven. like a stone rolled away, forgiven by the gift I've been given, forgiven when you removed all my shame, and I will never be the same. No matter what we've gone through, God wants to be there. It all begins with forgiveness. People think they're going to be exposed, but God brings deliverance. And by forgiving others, I can be forgiven. By forgiving others, I can be set free. By forgiving others, I can be forgiven. By forgiving others, they have no hold on me. And by forgiving others, we can be forgiven. By forgiving others, the torment is gone. By forgiving others, we can be forgiven. By forgiving others, we can now move on. So I'm forgiven, and a great weight is lifted. Forgiven, just like a stone rolled away. Forgiven, for all the sins I've committed. Forgiven, of all my guilt and my shame. 'Cause I'm forgiven in your name. I'm forgiven, and a great weight is lifted. Forgiven, like a stone rolled away, forgiven by the gift I've been given, forgiven when you removed all my pain. 'Cause I'm forgiven in your name. Yes, I'm forgiven, and I will never be the same. No more guilt and no more shame. No excuses and no blame. 'Cause I'm forgiven in your name. Okay. That is really the secret. People think that if you forgive somebody, you're letting them off the hook. But really, it's letting us off the hook because we are caught in a times like a twilight zone. We are stalled. We can't move forward. And by releasing with forgiveness, we release ourselves to be able to move forward. One of the things that we were looking at as we are forgiven, it isn't just forgiven so that we feel better. But we are called into spiritual warfare. We are called to go forward, and part of it is into the night, facing darkness and things we don't know. All around us, we see that happening. But the one stable point is that God is with us from beginning to end and wants to make his presence known and give us the ability to take what seems like darkness and turn it into noonday, turn it into the brightness of his presence, and to let his light shine. So here we go, noonday in the night. Into the night, facing darkness and things we don't yet know. Still into the night, with all of our might we now go. Oh, into the night, with darkness and fear all around. And into the night, uncertain of what will be found. Oh yes, and into the night, your unfiltered light will abound. And with the light of your power and grace, and in the light that shines from your face, oh, into the night, filled with your light we go. Yes, into the night, Filled with your light we now go. And the darkness has to flee as your light sets people free. And everyone will shine so bright, like noonday in the night, just like noonday in the night. We go to set the captives free, open the eyes that cannot see, to bring about what soon must be. Like noonday in the night, we shine like noonday in the night. No matter how dark it gets, God is there for us, and He will bring us through and make us to shine with the light of His countenance on all those in need. We go to set the captives free, open the eyes that cannot see, to bring about what soon must be. Like noonday in the night, yes, like noonday in the night. Oh, come illuminate the night, and shine like noonday in the night. Restored by your great light, like noonday in the night. Oh, come and bring your light, so we can shine so bright, like noonday in the night, just like noonday in the night. Oh yes, and into the night, restored by your light, we now go. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God wants to establish His presence. He wants to take whatever gloom and darkness we experience and bring us to His light, and then let us bring that light to those around us who are wandering around not knowing that there's hope, not knowing that there's any chance, and yet God brings that chance, and amazingly, He decides to use us to be a light to those around us who are walking in darkness and have no light. And it changes our perspective. It changes our ability to understand, ani ma'amin, I believe. What do we believe? We don't just believe with a mental affirmation, but with all of our being, like it says in the Amplified, to believe, trust in, cling to, and rely on Him. And when we do, God can make all grace abound. There are those who are challenging and death spots out there in the world, and yet God can either transform their hearts or protect the innocent by taking those despots out of the way. But we have a calling to see people's hearts transformed and changed. He's changed our hearts. He can change every heart out there if we're willing to change. Well, Shabbat Shalom. We welcome everyone to Beth Zion, and we are so glad you're here, and so glad we're here. So glad we have a place to meet. And looks like we've got most of the chairs filled today, too. So just the right size. Fits like a glove. Perfect. All right. So our calling as a congregation is to declare a Messiah to the Jewish heart of Central Jersey and to the world, to bring an understanding of who Yeshua is, share the truth of Yeshua through Jewish eyes. We share the truth of Yeshua through Jewish eyes not because we want to make everybody Jewish, but it's a Jewish faith for the whole world. And understanding the context of Yeshua's words, what He taught, what He said, and how consistent it was with Torah. You know, I always tell people, you hear me say this often, if your interpretation of the New Testament doesn't line up with the Torah, you misunderstood the context. Simple as that. Because there is nothing in the New Covenant that contradicts anything in the Tanakh or the Torah, the Hebrew Scriptures. And everything, when you understand it in context, just makes Messiah that much closer, that much more real when we look and see the things that He was saying. And when we share the truth of Yeshua through Jewish eyes, it brings clarity, it brings understanding, it brings a depth of insight that can change people's hearts and lives. And Yeshua said that He was the way, the truth, and the life. And He said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that is what we want to be able to present. Not just to present Yeshua, but present the truth of Yeshua, who is the truth, who is the way, who is the life. And we are grateful for the opportunity to share in every opportunity we have. And we should every morning wake up and say, Lord, what are the divine appointments that you have for me today? So if you're stuck in traffic, if you have something going on, just understand there may be something else working in the background that we don't know about. And say, Lord, what do you have appointed for me today? Help me to be discerning of it and not complaining about whatever seems to be an obstacle along the way. And be able to move and be found exactly in the center of God's will. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you for coming to your word now. We ask you to open up our hearts to hear what it is that you would have for us. Not the words of man, but Lord, speak from your heart to our hearts. Pour your Spirit out in a great way here today. And we thank you. You've already been pouring your Spirit out in a very special way. And we're really enjoying this, Lord. And we ask you to speak deeply to us and transform us by the power of your word. In Yeshua's name. Amen. Well, today's portion is called Tzav, given order or command. It's taken from Vayikra, Leviticus, chapter 6, verse 1. And it starts off with these words, Tzav et Aharon ve'et banav. Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the Torah of the burnt offering. It is the burnt offering because of the burning upon the altar. And it references the burnt offering as, in Hebrew, olah. It is what goes up, olah. It's the same word. The offering is what goes up. And so when we are praising the Lord, when we are lifting our voices to him, it is the olah. It is the burnt offering, in a sense, going up, the incense going up before God. And it says, on the firewood and upon the altar all night long and until morning. In this way, the fire of the altar will be kept burning. When the fire has consumed the burnt offering on the altar, the Kohen, having put on his linen garment and covered himself with the linen shorts, is to remove the ashes and put them beside the altar. Then he is to remove these garments and put on others before carrying the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. In this way, the fire of the altar will be kept burning and not be allowed to go out. Each morning, the Kohen is to kindle wood on it, arrange the burnt offering, and make the fat of the peace offerings go up in smoke. Fire is to be kept burning on the altar continually. It is not to go out. Now, we're going to be looking at a number of passages, but I want to start off with this just to give an idea. The title for this is Sin, Forgiveness, and Restitution. And what we're looking at last week's portion, it started after the tabernacle with the book of Exodus was completed. In Leviticus, it starts talking about what the priests were supposed to do, the Kohanim and the Levites, what they were to do. And we see it starting off with the offerings and the burnt offerings, the sin offerings, and all of these. And there are several. I want to touch on, they call it the korbanot, the offerings that were made, the sacrifices that were done during this time. But all of these things were for a particular purpose. And the purpose wasn't just to be able to have the smell of barbecue going on all the time. It wasn't for having picnics or things of that nature. But there was something about allowing people to be exposed or their sins to be exposed so that they could then come and experience forgiveness, and as a result also the restitution, being restored, being brought into a place where God is able to bring about changes in our life that we may never have imagined. And what I wanted to look at for a moment is something from last week's portion, and that was in Leviticus chapter 4, and it says this in verse 1. Hashem said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel, If anyone sins inadvertently against any of the mitzvot, the commands of the Lord, concerning things which should not be done, if he does any one of them, then if it is the anointed Kohen who sinned, he goes through and he has to do all of these offerings. You go down a little bit further and it mentions this phrase that repeats. We talked about that just a little bit, but last week we talked mostly about Purim and Esther. But it says in verse 13, chapter 4, verse 13, if the entire community of Israel inadvertently makes a mistake, with the assembly being unaware of the matter, and they do something against any of the mitzvot, the commands of Hashem, of the Lord, concerning things which should not be done, they are guilty. I mentioned this just a little bit because that phrase, they are guilty, as it goes through, it talks about different kinds of situations that arose. And he says they are guilty. And I'm amazed because normally we grow up in a mindset where we try to say, I didn't know, as if it's an excuse. We mentioned before, it says, ignorance of the law is no excuse. You're still guilty, and you still get the ticket. Even if you have a really good excuse. But he says, if the entire community of Israel inadvertently makes a mistake, you say, well, if you make a mistake, you can just let it go. But there is something about the focus. When we talked about how it said how the Kohanim would take the offering and how they changed their clothes to be able to take the ashes out and all this stuff, all of it was a ritual that was put into place to show the importance of what was happening and how valuable and how focused God was on the importance of those offerings and what it represented, so that the people would understand that this was something that was holy and that was something that God was bringing for the people. And it says inadvertently, if they do it inadvertently and they make a mistake and the assembly is unaware of the matter, how do you repent of something that you don't know exists? But when you do find it out, you find out you're already guilty. Now, the answer is not to say an excuse as to why this happened. It wasn't my fault. It was somebody else's fault. And it seems like we're living in a day, and maybe all of human nature is that way, that we're always looking for a scapegoat, somebody to blame for what it is. It's not my fault. I did what I was supposed to do. It's somebody else's fault because they looked at me funny or whatever it may be. But what he says they're guilty, it doesn't end with that. Because we're living in a time right now where everybody is viewed by having a different opinion as guilty. So people are canceling people because they don't agree with them. This is not what God is talking about. He's saying you're guilty, but it's not, period, the end. It is then that he says, when the sin that they have committed becomes known, then the assembly is to offer a young bull as a sin offering and bring it before the tent of meeting. The whole purpose of this is so that we don't remain guilty, that there is an avenue of return, that the sacrifices were meant to bring attention to the people of how they have kind of gone askew. They've walked away from where they need to be and where we need to be. And so what happens is he gives this command to them and tells them how to approach it, the Kohanim, how to approach this, the high priest and his sons. And it's fascinating because next week's portion talks about two of his sons bringing strange fire. They were doing what they were supposed to do, but there was a compromise. There wasn't the kind of connection that was supposed to be representing our relationship with God. They were in a way, as a sign to the people. They saw with all the ritual, and they saw with all of the details, the way that God wanted to have special care taken by the people to observe what was happening, because forgiveness of sin was very important to God. It still is today. And so when we look at this, there is the need to point out that you're guilty. You say, no, but I have a good excuse. No, you're still guilty. Now, there is something that doesn't leave you locked in a prison cell because you're guilty, but opens up the door for God to say, there's an atonement, there was a price paid for you, there is something that will open up. And the sacrificial system itself was a forerunner and a Vorspeise, if you will, an appetizer of what was to come. That what we saw even with the development of the tabernacle and later with the temple, there was this idea that he said to Moses with the tabernacle, build this tabernacle according to the pattern that you saw in the heavenlies. And they followed through on the blueprints that God laid out and signed off on. And if you remember, when the tabernacle was finished and also later when the temple was finished, there was a cloud of glory that came in that made it impossible for the Kohanim to do the things that they were supposed to do, because the power of God came in. It was like the signature of God signing off on the paperwork and saying, yes, approved, followed the rules correctly. You didn't have to have from the building department to show it, but God was building. God was doing something. And so he signed off on it with his power and his presence. And when we are being built the way God wants us to be built, there is something of a process that happens. We saw, I mentioned before with Shaul, Paul, when he was doing what he thought was right, but was wreaking havoc in the believing community, in the Jewish believing community, because at that time there were no other people besides Jewish people who were accepting Messiah. It was only about 20 or 30 years later that that whole event with Cornelius' house happened. It looks like, because you go through the book of Acts, it happened, must have been the next following week, he went to this, next week this happened. No, it was a long period of time. We see that Paul came on the scene as a believer years later. He was 13 years in Arabia. He talks about how all of the ways that God dealt with him during his time, his journey. And you remember when he was first confronted by the Lord and he was thrown to the ground and he was blind. And he said to the Ananias who came to him, he said, I will show him the things that he must suffer. Now here is a good example too, because that believer looked at it and said, God, you realize who this guy is? He's arresting believers. He's arresting people. Not the safest man to go to. And he says, I will show him the things that he must suffer. But I've told him that somebody is coming. And he went, and his eyes were opened. His blindness was taken away. And it was the beginning of his walk with the Lord. And when we look at it, all of the things that happened before, condoning the death of Stephen and all of those things that happened, there was a turnaround that nobody could have expected. None of the believing community, they probably hated this man because Stephen was such an amazing person, so gifted, and cut off so early, stoned to death because he was preaching the truth. They even covered their ears as he was speaking and stoned him because they said his face shone like an angel's face. And what did he do? He did what he saw Messiah do. He said, very similar to where Yeshua said, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. He said, don't hold us to their charge. Now, in all of those things, he saw a faith that went beyond his own life. He had a faith and a walk with the Lord that went beyond just the circumstances of being stoned and killed. He didn't know what was going to come as a result of it. And it's not to say that, oh, it was a good thing he died so that Paul could come along. There isn't anything good about the way that he died and the way he was executed. But in the process, God used that event to stir Paul in a way that he could only be stirred. It was something that captured his attention. And he captures our attention in different ways. I know in my experience, when I considered that Yeshua could be the Messiah, I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't expecting it. And certainly in the Black Pentecostal Church in North Philly I always jokingly say, where most Jewish kids hang out at college. But no, it was a very dramatic, God-breathed moment. And I experienced the power of God. I call it a power encounter that God brought in my life. It changed everything around me. I couldn't understand it, but I couldn't deny what had happened. And in the process of time, I began to understand how amazing God's love is. And he brought me from a place of sin to a place of forgiveness. And you know, it's funny, my mom used to say, well, what did you ever do wrong? You're perfect. I mean, they always, you know, you know, Jewish mothers are kind of like that. They assume that their sons never do anything wrong. And I said, Mom, you don't know. But there is something about the transforming work of God. I mentioned before in the song, Forgiven. It's like a weight lifted. We don't even recognize, you know, you can carry that weight for so long, and after a while, it's just a part of you. But you know when you notice how that weight is weighing us down? The moment it's lifted and taken away and said, where did all of it go? The stress, all those things changed. And in that moment, the weight is lifted. And then it isn't just saying, well, thank God that's gone. You look around and it says, by forgiving others, we can be forgiven. And you start to look and see the way that God is able to utilize forgiveness as a vehicle for bringing us his redemption, for restoring us, for bringing restitution. And in fact, one of the words used, the chatat, the sin offering that is used, is talking about the unintentional sins that we were looking at here in that passage in chapter 4. There is also down a little bit before I mentioned this idea of the guilt was there, but it wasn't like Jewish guilt that says, you put the knife in, you turn it, why don't you visit your mother? I don't want to say anything, but most children visit their mother. Why you don't? I don't know. It's up to you. You're busy. You don't care. There is that. Now, I found out there's also Italian guilt. There's mothers. It's mother's guilt. They know how to milk it with their kids. But the point is that it isn't just to be viewed as guilty. But the real joy is when that guilt is assuaged. It's removed. It's transformed. When we know we are forgiven. I mean, that is really where the burden is. When we go through these things in life, we begin to justify the things that we do that are not right. And the reason we justify it is because we don't want to feel that weight of condemnation that comes with guilt, the shame that is there. And there is that adversary plot that lets us know you never want to be viewed. You don't want anybody to see this. Hide it. And so we bury it, we hide it, and not realizing that, like they always say, better out than in. It's better to be open before God and let him transform us. When he does, everything around us changes, but the biggest change is when you feel that weight of oppression gone, and you wonder, where did it go? What is it that I did that brought it about? And it's not what we've done, it's what God has done. I remember one time reading, there was a story, it was a prophetic story, sort of like, what's it called? I forgot the name of it, but it was this story, and he went through all these trials and all these difficulties. What was that book? Anybody remember? Pilgrim's Progress, thank you. It was Pilgrim's Progress. But this was similar to it. But there was a point in the story that this other person had spoken where he went back as soon as he saw the joy of what it was. He made it to the end. Several went out on the journey. Only one man made it through. And he went back to tell the people, and he said, where did you go? A very wonderful thing would have happened if you waited and saw the prince. He said, well, I want to see the prince now. He says, we don't always see the prince. But why did you run back? She says, I wanted to tell them, it's all done, it's finished, he completed it, and he said, don't those scars mean anything? What scars? The scars along the way that were part of the battle that you went through in your life. The challenges that you met and overcame by the power of God. When you removed all of those things, he said, if there's a pin, it'll stick you. You've got to get rid of it. When we get rid of those things, the relief and the joy that comes in is overwhelming. It's not what we did. It's all of the cumulative things that God brought us through that cause us to experience the victory. Have you ever struggled with something for a long time, and every time you came to it, you thought, this time I'm going to make it. This time it's done. And then, boom, you find yourself trapped once again in the same thing. You said, how could I be so stupid? Why did I get to that again? And we wonder. And then one day, you look around and you say, hey, something's missing. Where did it go? What did I do? It wasn't what we did. It's what God did in the process of bringing us to the realization that we could be set free. And it doesn't hold us anymore. And it's like that weight lifted, that guilt taken away. And then God brings transformation. I mentioned that word in the Hebrew, chatat, which talks about the sin offering. There's another word, asham, which is the guilt offering. And part of it, if you look in chapter 6, fire is to be kept burning on the altar continually. It is not to go out. If you think about it, he talks about the restoration and the issue of restitution that is a part of this. And so it says, in a way, the offender has to make restitution plus add an additional fifth part to it, a 20% over that, if there is restitution. Remember also, if we look at Matthew 5, it says this in verse 21. It says, you have heard that our fathers were told, do not murder, and that anyone who commits murder will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who nurses anger against his brother will be subject to judgment. That whoever calls his brother you good for nothing will be brought before the Sanhedrin. That whoever says fool incurs the penalty of burning in the fire of Gehenna. This seems pretty strong. So if you are offering your gift at the temple altar and you remember there that your brother has something against you, leave your gift where it is by the altar and go make peace with your brother. Then come and offer your gift. In essence, you're making restitution for the things that you do. You're acknowledging what you did, but you're not saying with an excuse saying, well, that was years ago. Time heals all things. Well, time doesn't always heal all things. Many times we bury those things and we find it coming out in different ways. But there is something about making restitution. He said, leave your gift by the altar and go make peace with your brother. Then come back and offer your gift. If someone sues you, come to terms with him quickly while you and he are on the way to court, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer of the court, and you may be thrown in jail. Yes, indeed, I tell you, you will certainly not get out until you have paid the last penny. And then there's this phrase in verse 27 and 28 where he says, Matthew 5, it goes on, he says, you have heard that our fathers were told, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that a man who even looks at a woman with the purpose of lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. When you look at this, he's talking about the part where it says, again, if you heard it said, do not break an oath. He's saying if you've broken the one, you've broken it all. Now, he's not saying that you're guilty of all the things that are out there. You went through a traffic light, but now you're guilty of murder. It's not saying that, but he's saying that what he's saying is if you have violated one law, you're guilty of violating the law. So it's that you're guilty of violating all of Torah because all of it points to the same place. Our walk with God, our relationship with Him. Are you following me? So when he says, he's not saying, do you ever wonder when it says, if you are guilty of this, you're guilty of it all. He's not saying now you're guilty of murder and of adultery and of stealing and all of that. He's saying that you become, like for instance, if you get stopped by a traffic cop and you went through a light, you could say you violated this particular law, or you could say you broke the law. You're guilty of breaking the law. The law covers a lot of things. In particular, this particular thing you did. But when it comes to the Lord, there are no places where we can try to find an excuse that will work. We need to be able to understand that we're violating the very thing that God puts in place so that we could experience His presence with us. That's the whole purpose of why the sacrifice was put in place. That's the whole purpose why it was pointing to Yeshua, who laid His life down for us so that we could experience forgiveness and the restitution. Being able, He paid the penalty for us so that we could experience the transformation. It requires restitution. Messiah's death brought about the atonement that we needed. But His resurrection brought about the restitution that establishes for us all that was lost by our fall, and now restored by the presence of God coming in to make His presence and life known to us. So as we get to know Him better, we learn to trust Him more. That's how faith works. And as we do that, He begins to open up for us things we never saw before. I remember when I first was a believer, I was at Bible school, and I was saying, oh God, you may as well forget me. I'm worse than I ever was. I mean, there are things coming up in my life that never were there before. And I had a moment. It was sort of like, almost like a conversation. And I said, you just should let me go now, because I think I'm going to bring you shame, and it's just not, it won't be good. And it was sort of like, where are you going to go? I said, well, wherever you go, but you got to let me go. Which didn't make sense. And then it was almost like an audible voice. He said, Jan, I knew those things were there before I called you. And I called you anyway. And I began to weep. I began to cry, because in that moment, coming to the Messiah was wonderful. But in that moment, I understood that no matter how narrow that thread was that was holding on to me, there was a love that I had never experienced. And in that moment, I experienced an unconditional love that said, nothing will take me by surprise. God was saying, I knew those things were there before I called you, and I called you anyway. There's a lot more things you're going to see that you're going to lament. But it's a process of bringing you to where you need to be, and I'll bring you there. I won't leave you. I won't forsake you. And it was a turning point. It was the most powerful pivot point in my life. I tell people, coming to the Messiah was a great moment. But discovering how much He loved me was beyond anything I could have imagined. And now when things come along and challenges come in, and you know how we are susceptible to a lot of things that people say. Well, you call yourself a believer, and you did this. And you sit there and you go, yeah, it's bad. I shouldn't have done that. Oh, man, I'm miserable. I'm no good. And we go down this trail that is not the trail that God is leading us in, but the adversary, who is the accuser of the brethren. If he is accused, if it's an accusation, don't let it sit upon you. Don't try to make an excuse, because you are guilty perhaps. But whether you are or not, what I have found, and it's just something that the Lord had spoken to me, and it's been at the core of my being ever since, and I've mentioned it before, but when I feel that challenge, the accusation coming, you call your, look at how you did, you should, that's, and I instead of going into, yeah, I'm really bad, I find myself saying, you know, left to myself, I'm capable of worse. Doesn't matter what the accusation is. I said, left to myself, I'm capable of worse. But I'm not left to myself. Lord, if there's something you want to show me, if there's something you want to reveal, I open my heart, I offer myself to you. Come in and transform me and show me. what I'm doing in that moment is shifting from having a dialogue with the adversary who has no intention that is good towards me, and having my conversation shift to God who wants to transform and heal me and let me experience what it is. And oftentimes, somebody will say a word of accusation, and I bring it before the Lord. And I find that sometimes it will be the thing where I say, yeah, I didn't see it, it was a blind spot, and I move forward with it. But many times, as I bring it before the Lord, it's kind of interesting because I say, Lord, is there something to this? And he'll say, no. But now that I have your attention, there is something I want you to see. And I go, oh my gosh. And I see something I didn't see before. But it is God wanting to bring by his Spirit a discerning of what is going on. He searches the deep things of the heart. He comes in and he searches those out. He tests us. His Spirit comes to lead us and guide us into all truth. And when he does, he brings, yes, an exposure of sin. All those things that are missing the mark. Many of which we don't notice because we've allowed there to be a little fog around it, a little blur around the edges that says, well, God winks at this. This is okay. It's not exactly what it said, but, I think God's okay with it. And once we start to go down that slippery slope, the sin doesn't look like sin anymore. But the weight and the gravity of the guilt still is weighing on us, and we're not sure why, because we're not willing to address it. When we do, we get the relief of forgiveness because God is standing ready to provide the atonement that is there already purchased for us. And when we do, we come and experience his restoration and the restitution of that which was lost. You've heard, even with certain things, he said, you have heard that our fathers were told, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, there isn't a place where it says to hate your enemy. It says to love your neighbor. But the mindset was, love your enemy, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Then you will become children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun shine on good and bad people alike, and he sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous alike. What reward do you get if you love only those who love you? Well, even tax collectors do that. Now, if there are any tax collectors here, no offense. But he's saying that there is something more that God wants to do. Therefore, be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That doesn't mean that we become perfect like God, but there is a perfecting that God is working in us to will and to do of his good pleasure. I want to look just for a moment at 1 John chapter 1, start in verse 6. If we claim to have fellowship with him while we are walking in darkness, we are lying and not living out the truth. When we allow those things to have excuses that replace what will transform us, we are putting ourselves in a prison of our own making. But if we are walking in the light as he is in the light, then we have fellowship with each other, and the blood of his Son Yeshua purifies us from all sin. If we claim not to have sin, we're deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. Verse 9, if we acknowledge our sins, then since he is trustworthy and just, he will forgive them and purify us from all wrongdoing. Want to be free from the sin that is there? Don't try to cover it. Expose it before God. Let him expose it before us. He won't condemn us. What he will do is purify and heal us. He'll forgive us, and he'll cause us to experience a change. If we claim to have not been sinning, we're making him out to be a liar, and his word is not in us. And then he says, my children, I'm writing you these things so that you won't sin. But if anyone does sin, and this is why it is so powerful, what God has brought us. In the world, if you sin, you say, I'm going up to be a Supreme Court nominee. What did you do in high school? Oh, no. What did I do in high school? And whether it's true or not true, people will bring up things from the past, hoping you'll just back down because you don't want to be exposed, whether it's true or false. The fact is, though, that you move on from the things that we do when we're younger, and God is able to change and transform us. Whatever it was we did when you were a kid that you don't appreciate today, that you would never want your kids to do, do you sit back and just simply say, well, kids will be kids? If our kids start to do that, do we say, well, kids will be kids? You understand the repercussions of what took place, that you got by. I know a friend of ours for many years. He had been involved in the hippie movement and all that stuff and was on drugs and all of that. His son later died from drug overdose. And the point was that in his time, he was spared. He wasn't able to speak into his son's life. Doing the same things and said kids will be kids. It wasn't the same anymore. The drugs, their potency had changed. What it was laced with was enough to kill him. And so it's not like you just have the same event happening and say, well, I got through, so he'll get through. There is something that happens when we recognize what the cost was, and even if we were spared the tragedy of it in some measure, we have a responsibility to present something that will bring healing and deliverance to others, especially when it comes to our children. But he says that if anyone does sin, we have Yeshua the Messiah, the tzaddik, the righteous one, who pleads on our cause with the Father. Also, he is the kapora, the covering for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for those of the whole world. The way we can be sure we know him is if we are obeying his commands. The portion this week, Tzav, means commands. And as we follow the order that God lays out for us, he's able to bring about a transformation, not just to obey what he says, as we'll see next week. Aaron's sons did what they were supposed to do, but there was compromise in what they did. And it's not enough to settle for the least you need to do. If we go through life saying, what's the least I need to do to get by? What's the least I need to do to make sure I make it to heaven? What's the least I need to do? You're already in trouble because it's a slippery slope. Keep the fire on the altar burning. Burn it all. It says after they consumed it, after they ate it, it says burn it all. You don't leave anything left. And don't, it's kind of interesting because the reference to this goes back to the Shabbos candles, the Shabbat candles, when they're lit. One of the things that happens, and also with a Hanukkah when we light that, when it's done, you don't blow them out because you're leaving. You wait. Because what it is that it's the idea you don't blow out a Shabbos candle. Why don't you blow it out? Because you're to leave the fire burning until it dwindles on its own. And it goes back to this thing that is said here. They bring it back to this. The idea that you were to let it burn, you're to make sure the fire is continually burning. And when it comes to our walk with the Lord, the fire in our belly, the cause that God is stirring within us, we need to allow that fire to burn, to kindle, and to grow, and to expand so that it brings the warmth of God's presence and it brings a declaration of God's power to come into the hearts of all those we come in contact with. So that we can bring someone, today people talk about wanting restitution. They want restitution for what happened centuries ago or happened hundreds of years ago or whatever it was. The point is that if we are holding on to what someone else did as the excuse for restitution, we'll never experience real restitution. But God wants to bring a transformation in our hearts that will allow us to experience forgiveness from our sins, causing us to not be any more in the position of guilt, but being set free, experiencing restitution, and then having a heart to restore other people. And so I was saying you could say this if you made it a longer title. Sin, forgiveness, and restitution. Forgiveness, restitution, restoration, reconciliation. All of these, he says, you've been reconciled to God in Corinthians. He says, and now you have been given the ministry of reconciliation. We are called to reconcile others back to God. We are called to reconcile, to walk in a reconciled state. And it's our walking in a reconciled state with God that is the avenue that people are reading when it says we are living letters, known and read of all people. When people look at us, there's that statement that is often made, to be a testimony, and if need be, even use words. Our life is being read by people all the time. And the authenticity of what it is that God is doing in our life is something that people read and see. We may not know, but there are those times that people have had where you've been at work and you lived this with a testimony. And when somebody who ridiculed you perhaps one day says, look, I'm going through something, you're the only person I feel comfortable talking to because you've never said a bad word. But what happens in a situation where you've lived a testimony and one day, boom, you let it rip? People say, I knew that was coming. I thought, boy, I knew you were a hypocrite. I knew it couldn't be true. It could be tarnished so quickly. And so it isn't just how we're viewed, but it's how we are viewed by God and how we take seriously what he has given us. So that we don't just simply say, like we'll see next week, the sons of Aaron did what they were supposed to do, but they went for the minimum. And then they looked to see what they could get out of it. And in the process, we find something later on added. Don't go into the temple to do the service of the Lord when you're drunk. Clearly, that's what happened. Because they were killed like that by the power of God. And so we want to be able to see God move in wonderful ways. There's also one other passage I want to mention in Isaiah 53. There's an interesting word that uses the word asham. It's where it says, and the Lord wished to crush him. He made him ill. If his soul makes itself restitution, asham, he shall see children. He shall prolong his days, and God's purpose shall prosper in his hand. There is that idea that God, in what Messiah did as the suffering servant, opens the door of restitution for us so that we can be set free from all those things that held us bound. It's also his promise to do these things. One last verse. In James, Yaakov, it says this in James 2 and verse 10. For a person who keeps the whole Torah, this is the one I was thinking about before. I thought it was in that other section, but it's here. For a person who keeps the whole Torah, yet stumbles at one point, has become guilty of breaking them all. That doesn't mean you go to jail for something you didn't do, but he's saying the one who keeps the whole Torah, yet stumbles at one point, has become guilty of breaking them all. For the one who said, don't commit adultery, also said, don't murder. Now, if you don't commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the Torah. He's looking at the whole body of God's commands as what is so important for us to be able to be walking in sync with. Keep speaking and acting like people who will be judged by a Torah which gives freedom. For judgment will be without mercy towards one who doesn't show mercy, but mercy wins out over judgment. There is something very powerful about what God is doing. He said, but someone will say that you have faith and I have action. Show me this faith of yours without the actions, and I'll show you my faith by my actions. It isn't just saying what your belief system is. It's acting it out in our lives in a way that will be transformative, and others will read those pages. I tell people, if you see something bad in me, you're probably reading a page I wrote myself. Read the pages that God wrote, and let me, by God's Spirit, eliminate those handwritten pages, those pages that are there to pump myself up for some reason. But let God have his way. Let him be God. Don't try to do what God says he will do. Do what you're supposed to do, and let God be God and do what he promised to do. And we will walk in a manner that will bring transformation in life. Letting Yeshua come in and taking charge of our lives. That's what, if you love me, keep my commands. He's not saying do what I say in some ruthless way, but he's saying that there is some kind of a power that happens when we walk according to the order that God lays out for us, so that we can see God do exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask, think, or imagine, by the power of his Spirit working in us, bringing restitution, bringing restoration, bringing reconciliation, and helping to reconcile others to the Lord. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you for this time and for these words. Lord, we ask you to transform us so that we can be able to see around us those golden opportunities that you have for us to be a light to the world around us, to allow your power and your presence to be made manifest in a way that causes us to walk and choose to fulfill your commands, to walk in a manner, not the minutiae details of all of these things, but walking with an attitude of obedience to you, listening for that still small voice, listening to the Ruach speaking, the Spirit of God speaking deep to our spirit, speaking to the very core of our being, the warp and woof of our nature, the discerner of thoughts and intents of the heart. Lord, give us the ability to hear in all of the tumultuous sounds that are out there in the world, all the voices clamoring for our attention. Help us to hear that still small voice of your Spirit speaking to us. Come and make your home in us as you promised. Come and make your presence there and help us to emulate you who are living in us. Make your home in us and help us to see new vistas that we can't even imagine as we yield ourselves to you in every way. That we would see in this region you pour your Spirit upon all the populations around us. That you would give us opportunities to be able to share to the heart of where people are, and to see you bring the revelation of your life in a way that will transform them and their families, and that we would see you do things beyond our imagination and beyond our ability. We just want to be available for you to do what you said you would do, and to yield ourselves in a way that will not compromise that calling and that purpose and plan of your heart for us, individually and collectively. We thank you, Lord, in Yeshua's name. Amen. Let's all stand, and we can fellowship afterwards. But as Aaron blessed the people of Israel, so we bless one another with these words. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Yair Adonai panav elecha v'hunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yosem lecha shalom. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Hashem Sar Shalom, in the name of our Prince of Peace, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. And everyone agreed by saying Amen and Amen. Greet one another. Let's fellowship together and